Good day, everyone. Gary and I are back with some COVID topics and updates on what's new in the world. So let's get started. So Gary, I just printed off our first graph, which is COVID cases. You're all familiar with this, and I'm not sure if you people were aware that we had a little bump in the last few weeks.
That's right.
And it's starting to come down again. But what really strikes me about this is we have never gotten down to the baseline level that we had between the previous spikes, and this is just lab testing too.
But we've always been above 5%, never come below that. Now it's at 10% again, and it's underrepresented because of home testing.
Are you seeing a reflection of this in the hospital?
Well, I'm seeing actually more cases in the hospital. They're not severely COVID cases, but patients with COVID needing oxygen, not in the ICU, at least not recently. But recently, Steve Mitnick had a case over the weekend where he had someone who came in with a respiratory illness, and he tested them. They were positive for the flu on point-of-care testing, and then he sent off a COVID test. They also had COVID. So
wow. Influenza
A and on COVID, marginal O2 sats and normal chest X-ray, and then he did really well, and he appropriately put him on treatment. So we're seeing probably much more ambulatory than we are inpatient, but we are still seeing more inpatient, and it kind of reflects this. It undulates along the way.
And flu, I mean, I assume this is March now. We thought we might have that bimodal, but it appears we're not going to have that.
Right, so we're looking at other countries, other parts of the world, to see if there's another strain of the flu or another type of the flu that's emerging, and so far nothing's come up. So we may get away this year with an early severe flu season, but without a second hump later in the year. So that's good news.
You mentioned to me there was some new stuff on the home testing front.
Yeah, so let me show you this slide. So FDA just authorized this. This is the first slide for, this is the first time the FDA has authorized a test for flu and COVID. So this is Lucira, and they're using this platform for home testing for flu and COVID. We're not going to be using Lucira as much in the center footprint here. We were using it in some of the areas for point of care testing, but it's going to be more available at the home center. And I think the company is marketing this, to be used at home.
And I want to take that as an opportunity to recommend to people that on May 11th, the government is going to suspend a national emergency that's been intact for 3 years.
Right.
And one practical thing is free home tests will no longer be available. So, insurances are required to provide you with 8. You can get that through our insurance. You can get some through the Postal Service. You and your patients might want to stock up on home tests before May 11th.
That's a good idea.
Okay. What about vaccinations? Are there anything new in the vaccination world?
Yeah, so Moderna just had published a study of an mRNA flu vaccine. So the mRNA vaccine is the platform for the best COVID vaccines in the world, and we have both of them, Pfizer and Moderna. And Moderna is also working on the mRNA vaccine to develop for influenza at the same time. That's going to be important because if they can perfect this, then we can get a flu and a COVID vaccine at the same time, probably the same shot.
Okay. I mean, why would they do that at this time of the year? Because we've already got a vaccine. Is it going to be better, they think? Is that why? Or is this just trying to get the market?
It's a very good question, Gary. The flu vaccine is just okay. In fact, in an MMWR this year, the flu vaccine efficacy was about 54%. So it's an okay vaccine. It's not a great vaccine. Compare that to the measles vaccine, which is above 90% efficacy. So we need a better flu vaccine, and I think the mRNA platform could be a platform that would improve our yearly flu vaccine. The other thing is that much of the vaccine for flu is still grown in eggs, and that takes 6 months. And then there's some recombinant vaccine, but the mRNA vaccine doesn't take as long to produce because it's a recombinant thing.
That makes sense.
So this could be a new vaccine breakthrough if it works for influenza and COVID, and then you market them all in one shot.
Okay. We've been in this situation now for 3 years, folks, and I remember talking at the beginning of this whole situation of what did you do with this novel virus we couldn't even identify, didn't have tests, and I said at the beginning, this is going to be heaven for epidemiology students. You're getting your PhD in epidemiology, you got plenty of options of what you can write about different countries, how they respond, and so forth. So it is time, I think, for us to start taking look backs and seeing, what has transpired. And actually, Jeremy Meshes, I went to him, showed me this study just yesterday in the Journal of American Medicine. That's our next slide here. COVID, it's titled COVID Vaccine Hesitancy and Risk of a Traffic Crash. They looked at 11 million people, and there was a statistical significant difference between those who had a vaccine and those who were not vaccinated. far more traffic accidents. So we could riff on this for a long time, but I'm going to turn it back to you and say, in medicine, are there any look backs now? Are you learning anything about COVID over the 3 years?
Yeah, so when we first started doing the videos, we talked about the mortality of COVID. And we knew that way back at the first part of the pandemic, that there was a 10% higher mortality with COVID. So flu, about a 1% mortality every year.
10 times.
10% mortality with COVID, which is really tough. And then recently, to kind of follow the Omicron strain, there was an article published in JAMA. So let me show this. At the very first part of this slide, I title it, which is more dangerous, COVID-19, Omicron strain, or influenza? And in the middle, I'm going to put this this article that came out in JAMA just on February 14th, where this is a study from Switzerland. And let me show you the data at the lower part. It's a study from January to March of last year. The strains were actually typed, and they typed them 99% were Omicron strain. 98% of the Swiss population has already been vaccinated. And despite that, there were 5,200 hospitalizations that were in this study. And some had COVID, some had the flu. 7% of the patients with COVID died. 4% of the patients with flu died. Now, in the past, in Switzerland, up to 12.8% of patients died in 2020 of COVID when they were hospitalized. So mortality got better from the Omicron strain, both because the Omicron strain was less virulent, and two, they had a vaccinated population now, but still, it was almost double that of influenza mortality. And so I think this is a kind of telltale study to show us that COVID-19, even the Omicron strain, is not only more contagious, but it's also more dangerous to be hospitalized this and not to survive this than influenza. So here's another way to look at this. This is not from the study. I actually put this together. I think it's kind of interesting. So I'm going to kind of break this down for you. I'm going to show you the mortality, the death rate of influenza versus COVID. Now, on the right of this slide is typically what we think about with influenza, where it affects the very young. You see a signal to the left. The very young, and each column represents a different age group. And then as you can see, the death rate goes up as people get older. So with flu, we've always worried about the very young, the very old. And about 20 to 50,000 patients will die of influenza in the United States every year. And that varies depending on the strain and depending on the vaccine efficacy and uptake. Now I'm going to show you to the left-hand side. The left-hand side graph is going to be COVID deaths. And as you can see, there's a slight signal in the very, very young, but there's a stronger signal as people get older. In influenza, there's actually a stronger signal between 18 and 49 years of age, but still, even in the younger population up to age 50, there's a signal of mortality. In COVID, just last year alone, in 2022 in the US, 270,000 deaths. So compare that to 50,000. So that's a virus that remains 5 times worse than influenza. And then what's really important about this slide is that notice that in every age group, even though the bar might be small, someone's going to die. So an 18-year-old is going to die, a 25-year-old is going to die, a 35-year-old is going to die. The risk is much lower, but the certainty of survival is not 100%. And so that's the tragedy behind this. We always hear about, wow, high school kid got admitted with influenza and didn't survive. They didn't really have any comorbid medical problems. We're going to find that same thing with COVID, that in every age group, someone may not survive. But what we really worry about with COVID, like influenza, is the very young and the very old. So vaccination is really important. And where we said before that COVID was 10 times more dangerous than influenza, now I would say that COVID is probably 2 to 5 times more dangerous than influenza.
It'll be interesting to see that as the virus evolves, if that trajectory will continue and it'll get less and less mortality associated with COVID, and it'll approach that of the flu, or what will happen. But that's been the trajectory so far. We'll see.
Yeah, I think what's going to happen is that I think we're going to have this just as dangerous virus, but our herd immunity is going to be better. So year after year after year, we're probably going to stack up natural and vaccine immunity, and we're going to be safer as a population. But if you see another population that's not well vaccinated, perhaps in a third world country, I think it's going to be very dangerous again.
Yeah. Well, good. Let's just wrap up, Gary, with some brief announcements. We've got an audience here. And I'm going to ask you to talk about the first one because it has to do with your quality position.
Right, so just to let everyone know, a couple of years ago we had this thing called the IMQ, which is an accreditation, and that has gone away, and now we're going to do what's called AAA HC, accreditation. We're working on that this year, and you'll be hearing more about this as time goes on, but there's been a lot of work already with policies and procedures. The staff's gonna know about it. But this is kind of like Joint Commission for the hospital. AAA-HC is gonna be our accreditation for the ambulatory setting. So that's gonna be happening this year, more to come later.
Good. Next slide, just a reminder for those of you who RSVP'd and got your foot in the door. This Saturday night is movie night. It's going to be a social time if you want to show up as early as 6 o'clock. And the movie starts at 7, Ant-Man, out there for your viewing.
And Gary, it's sold out?
Yeah. So, March 11th, the following Saturday, is our quarterly Empire Food Bank volunteer morning from 9 to 12. And Lily was sending out an invite because we do like to have an RSVP so that we can let them know how many people are coming. This next slide is just to advise you about, we have an all-group meeting this month. We're going to be meeting at John Ash. Have some fine food. Should be a good encounter. And as I put on here, our special guest is Warner Thomas, the new CEO for Sutter Health. He's going to speak to us and field questions. So it should be a great opportunity for all of us, and with some good food in a nice setting. And then the last slide I have for you is we have a trivia night coming up. So the Wellbeing Committee has set up a trivia night for April 14. It's going to be at Carmen's Burger Bar. So good burgers. We actually have a DJ of sorts who does this for a living, does trivia nights, and he'll be there. It should be fun. Last thing I want to say, I want to put on my fiscal hat for the group and just touch on some social etiquette. A lot of the events that we do, including all group meetings, when we do them at a destination, we pay by the head. It's expensive, and so if you RSVP, please do come. If you don't think you're going to come, don't RSVP. We've left a lot of money on the table over some events over the last year, so just a heads up. All right, thanks for listening. Hope that was useful.